Hi VC. Today I'm going to do part 2 of Same Name, Different Band, which if you missed the first one is what it says. A couple of bands, in one case here 3 bands who share the same name, and I'm going to talk about their relative merits and decide who deserves to hold the name. Okay, start off with one everybody knows. That's Asia and their debut self-titled album from 1982. Great Roger Dean cover art there. Now in 82 this was all over the radio. Pretty much every song I think got played, and even someone who was as ignorant of rock music as my dad was got to hear it, because even Radio 2 were playing songs off this, because it was very slick, commercial, poppy prog rock. And as such, it gets some criticism, but I always loved it. Always loved it. Like I say, every song got played. Every song was worthy of being played. Heat of the Moment, Only Time Will Tell, Soul Survivor, One Step Closer. That's just the first 4 tracks on the album, and they're all classics. Great album with a stellar lineup. You've got Jeff Downes, who had been in Yes and previously in Buggles. Steve Howe, of course, from Yes on guitar. Carl Palmer from ELP on drums. And John Wetton, who's played with just about everybody, on lead vocals and bass. And it is a brilliant album. Not too crazy about any of their subsequent albums, but this, can't argue with the quality. It's fantastic. But they weren't the first band to be called Asia. There was also this band, an American band called Asia. This album, Armed to the Teeth, I think is their second album. They did one other album. This came out originally in 1980, so a couple of years prior to the British Asia. If that makes sense, British Asia, yeah. This is pompous or pomp prog rock, tons of harpsichord and mellotron, twin lead guitars, a vocalist with a real high, clear, almost feminine voice. Yeah, it's fantastic stuff. And if it was better known, perhaps they wouldn't have been bullied out of using the name, which is basically what happened when the Steve Howe led Asia came along. I think this lot were basically told, we're going to use the name, what are you going to do about it? And money talks, and this lot folded, I think, which is a shame, because this is a really, really good album. Plenty of highlights on here, it's all good, but the track Xanadu has a sort of interesting snaking melody on the pre-chorus and classically inspired guitar parts. This is a 2015 unofficial reissue, and it's on the Acid Nightmares label, and it's a really good pressing. Sounds absolutely great. Let's say it's originally a private pressing, so it's pretty difficult to pick up in its original form, but if you see this, don't hesitate to pick it up. Lots of long tracks on here, lots of time changes, most definitely prog, that US slant on prog, which I particularly like. So this is a tough one. Who's most deserving of keeping the name? I'm going to have to call this one a tie. This, because I've had this for years, I'm most familiar with it, and I haven't tired of it. Every now and then it does go on, and I really enjoy it every time I listen to it. This I've had for probably about 5 years, and still enjoying it, still getting to know it though, but I can't split them. It's a tie. Next we have a band called Omega from Hungary, and I just want to zoom in on the band outfits there. And this came out in 1978, and I think perhaps the influence of ABBA had something to do with those outfits, but ouch. That's got to be one of the most embarrassing album covers of all time, I should think. This guy here in particular looks absolutely mortified to be wearing that stuff. But, they had the balls to do it, and it doesn't stop it being a good album. I do remember when I bought this, the guy at the counter was smirking. I just said to him, don't be distracted by those outfits. This is a really good band. He wasn't convinced. But they are a really good band. I think they've been going since about 1962 in one form or another. Like I say, came out of Hungary, Budapest. And this is symphonic prog with touches of Pink Floyd, particularly on the track The Lost Prophet, last track on side 1. And elsewhere there's some sort of more looser hard rock. There's great guitar all over this. Lots of analogue synths. The vocals are strong and not particularly heavily accented, because I know that really bothers some people. It doesn't bother me. I quite like it. It just adds character to a voice as far as I'm concerned. And I can recommend everything I've heard by Omega. Their back catalogue is pretty convoluted because they seem to issue different versions of different albums depending on what territory they were targeting. I think some of their albums were available in their sort of native tongue, others sung in English, like this one. So good luck getting their entire back catalogue if that's what you're after. But this is a great place to start. I say this came out in 1978. This is an issue on. This was issued on the Bassless Bellafon label in West Germany. For me, the highlight on here is probably the final track on the second side, which is called Final. On that, there are loads of those Uriah Heep-like harmony vocals that I love so much. So check them out. Don't be put off by the cover. Really, really great band. And they weren't the only band to go under the name Omega. There was also this lot, Omega out of the UK. And they kind of fall under the new wave of British heavy metal kind of umbrella, I suppose. This came out in 85, so probably a bit late for Nwabam really, but it did kind of drag on for a fair bit, with sort of varying levels of success. And this, it's melodic, progressive metal / neo-prog. So if you can imagine if Fish had fronted a Nwabam band, that's kind of the sound they've got. They sort of, they sound a bit like Demon, a bit like Palace, a bit like Marillion. The band was formerly known as Apocalypse, and the album is quite apocalyptic sounding, which is appropriate. Let down in places by some pretty dumb lyrics, particularly on the track Drive Me Crazy. I mean, the song title doesn't really inspire much confidence, does it? But it's a good album. Really good album. Comes with a lyric insert. And it's on the Rock Machine label. Not particularly inspired looking label, but the sounds on here, pretty good. So, what's it going to be? UK Omega or Hungarian Omega? Well, it's got to be this, hasn't it? Fantastic. And the fact they've had such a long career says a lot. And I've got a few of their albums. I've got to say they're all great. They all vary. Their sound has progressed over the years and changed, and sometimes it's more symphonic prog, sometimes it's got slightly more of that psych edge to it or space rock sound. But this is great. So Omega. Next up, got a couple of bands who share the name Clearlight. And first, we have the LA-based band who have a very West Coast psych sound, very Doors influenced. You can hear a bit of the Birds in here, bit of Love. And this album was produced by Paul Rothchild, who of course was famous for producing the Doors albums. And this lot get compared to the Doors, and there are definitely some similarities. There's that sort of carnivalesque organ that Ray Manzarek was famous for. Marshall drumming, acid guitar. But what it doesn't have is Morrison's baritone, commanding vocal. There's none of that Morrison howl on here. It's a decent voice, but any similarities to the Doors end at the vocals. You've got Dallas Taylor on drums here, lurking in the background there, and he would later turn up with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. In fact, there's two drummers on this album playing at the same time. Not that you can particularly tell. Not quite sure what the rationale was behind that, because it doesn't seem to add anything to my ears. But the drums are brilliantly recorded. It's a you'd expect it, wouldn't you, Paul Rothchild, but it's a really well recorded album. And those drums are absolutely fantastic. The album as a whole is superb. It just doesn't let up from beginning to end. This doesn't quite have, doesn't get the praise it deserves, I don't think, and it can still be picked up pretty cheaply. There you go. There's the inner sleeve. Dallas Taylor again, and it's on that gold Electra label. So yeah, it's really good stuff. Very West Coast sounding, like I say. And one you owe it to yourself to check out if you've been put off by some reviews. I mean, the Doors comparison is just too lazy. I hate it when those sort of comparisons are stuck to and used as a way to dismiss a band, because it's a really good album in its own right. In fact, if you went listening to it because you love the Doors and wanted to find an album that sounds like the Doors, you might be disappointed, because they sound like Clear Light. Then there's a band out of France called Clear Light, who released this album Symphony. In fact, they released a number of albums, and there's a bit of the jury's out on whether the band was called Clear Light Symphony or just Clear Light at this time, but they certainly released other albums under the name Clear Light. And the first thing to say is what beautiful cover art that is. Again, it's one of those albums I would have picked up just for the cover. I'd want to give that a chance, because anyone who releases music with a cover art like that, you would imagine that they're going to be just as fastidious in how they present themselves musically. And it doesn't disappoint. There are members of Gong on this. Steve Hillage even plays on the first side. And to my ears, that sounds a little bit phoned in. It's a bit of a symphonic prog jam, I suppose. And of course, the playing is fantastic, but it does sound like a bit of a jam with Hillage over the top. He's fantastic playing, but it doesn't sound particularly planned out. The B-side is where this album comes alive. It has far more structure and variation. The guitar interplay with the synths is fantastic. It sounds far more pre-planned, rehearsed and structured. There's more variation in tempo. All in all, it's a far better listen than the A-side. And there's some chaotic sounding moments on the B-side which make this sound almost as close to psychedelia as symphonic prog at times. So I can thoroughly recommend this album. It came out on the Virgin, Two Virgins label. So who wins the showdown between the two Clear Lights? Well, it's a close run thing. If we're going on cover art, obviously it'd be this one. But it's got to be the LA band. Great album. Did you know there were at least two bands called Aviator? It's a very generic name, I suppose. But there's this bunch, who were a British prog band. And this album came out when did this come out? 1980. So they're late in the day for prog. But it's good stuff. It features Mick Rogers on lead vocals and guitar. And he played with Manfred Mann's Earth Band. and he's a brilliant guitar player and doesn't get his due, to be honest. He's really a bit special, and on this, plays his arse off. Got Clive Bunker on drums, who was on, I think, the first 4 or so Jethro Tull albums, if I remember right. So it's a trio. John Perry on bass guitar. Not sure who he'd played with previously, but I should have looked that one up. But it's really good stuff, and great album cover as well. So Turbulence, they did 2 albums. This is the second one. First one was just self-titled. And what does it sound like? I suppose it takes until the 3rd track, the title track, to really come alive, this album, and to sort of reinforce its prog credentials, I suppose. And that sounds a lot like 80s King Crimson, which is always a good thing, isn't it? And there's some nice Eastern sounding chords on that track as well. Like I say, Mick Rogers does a great job on here. What other tracks? There's a track called Ovation, the last track on side 1, which is it's a bit of a moody plodder, which is sort of built on an acoustic guitar, no doubt an Ovation guitar, which I imagine is why the track's called that. Then elsewhere, Fallen Star at the start of the B-side has a slight sort of fusion style to it. Again, fantastic guitar playing from Mick Rogers, and surprisingly some great twin kicks work from Clive Bunker, who is showing himself to be a much more accomplished drummer than you'd ever have guessed from his contributions to Jethro Tull. Not that he was bad in Tull, but he ups his game on this album. In fact, there's a track called Track 11, which confusingly is track 6 on here, which is just a drum solo. But don't let that put you off, because it's so heavily sort of electronically treated, it becomes something else altogether. It's a really interesting and entertaining effort, it really is. So, really good album, and I can thoroughly recommend it. Of their 2 albums, this is probably my favourite. And yeah, so that's the UK Aviator. Then the American Aviator. And this album came out in 1986, I think. And it's an AOR album. It's that big 80s commercial melodic rock. And I used to like this album a lot more than I do now. And I played it recently, and it sounds pretty generic to me. It reminds me of the British band FM, who were about as good as AOR bands got coming out of the UK. But this just seems to lack whatever it was that made Journey and Boston and Survivor and Foreigner so special. It's really, really not a great album. I know AOR aficionados drool over this album, but it just lacks something to make it stand out for me. So you know where this one's going. No competition. The British Aviator. Back in 1972, a band called Tobruk came out of Brazil. And there seems to be some disagreement when you look online about whether this band consisted of American musicians who relocated to Brazil and put out this album, or whether they are actually Brazilians who decided to take anglicised names, perhaps, as a bid to get accepted with English-speaking audiences. Certainly the track names are all in English. So I don't know, are they Brazilian? Are they American? I don't know. But this is a really interesting album. The originals from 72, very expensive and difficult to track down. This, I think, is a Brazilian reissue, an unofficial reissue. And when it was released, I have no idea, but I would guess, looking at probably sometime in the late 80s. There are 5 tracks on the A side, and they consist largely of what sound almost like Booker T and the MG's style R&B with some psych effects, some acid guitar snaking its way through the tracks. And there's also a second vocal on there, sort of a background vocal, a real sort of sinister vibe to it. So it definitely has a trippy psychedelic vibe to it, but that A side, it's good, but it won't blow you away. It didn't blow me away anyway. Whereas on the second side, there's just 2 tracks. And the popular opinion seems to be that the first track is the disappointing track on this album, but I really enjoy it. It's sort of meandering, laid back, proggy psych. Doesn't really go anywhere, but has great atmosphere. But then you come to the final track on the album, Send It for Tomorrow, which is avant-garde, slightly chaotic psych, and it's superb. And it has, all the way through, it has what sounds like some lunatic let loose on a stylophone played through a fuzz effect. And it sounds amazing. It sounds really good. So it's a really interesting album. I love that unhinged artwork as well. The album's called Ad Lib, incidentally. But yeah, it's great stuff. And it's funny because nobody seems to agree on who's in the band or which the best tracks are. But for me, the whole thing's good. But the B-side definitely is a standout. Then, part of a Nawabum, new wave of British heavy metal again. A bit late to the party, came to Brook. And they had a fair bit of press at the time, I seem to remember, and looked like they might be going places. It's very commercial, melodic hard rock, but with a singer who's got a really gravelly voice. It reminds me of David Glenn Isley, who sang with Jafria and Dirty White Boy. And this is kind of what this album sounds like. It's quite like Jafria and House of Lords and those sort of bands. It's melodic hard rock, bordering on AOR, but it's got a tougher edge to that. Tougher edge than that. There's some really commercial tracks on here. Wild on the Run is a particular highlight. Falling. She's Nobody's Angel. And what I do remember about this band, one thing is that the track Falling was released as a single, and there was a competition in the press that you could win a parachute jump with Tobruk if you bought the single and applied, sent off for the competition. And the band got cold feet and refused to go through the parachute jump, so they just let their fans throw themselves out of the plane instead. So I always thought that was quite entertaining, and perhaps that was part of their downfall, excuse the pun, that they were seen as being not the real deal. But it's a really good album. If you're into that sort of melodic hard rock, bands like UFO and Jafria, that kind of thing, you could do a lot worse. I didn't play this for years. In fact, I think my original copy, I'd lost it, lent it, sold it, can't remember what. And I picked this up again a few years ago. I thought, wow, I should never have got rid of this. Decent stuff. So, Brazilian Tobruk, English Tobruk. It's a dead heat. The music is so different, but they're both so enjoyable. There you go. Tobruk. Now this is where it gets really confusing, because I've got 3 bands here who share the same name. Now, in the comments on my last video on this thing, there's a bit of discussion about whether I should have included this band. And the reason I didn't originally is because they all spell the name differently. But I was being pedantic. It's obvious. They're all sharing the name, even if some of them can't spell and some can. So the band is Alcatrazz, or the bands are Alcatrazz. And I'll do these in the order they were released, I think. And first off, we have Alcatrazz, spelt with 1 Z and a K, but spelt the way it is on the cover there. And this lot were out of Wales. They just released this one album. This features a couple of guys, Will Youatt and James Davis, who previously played in Quicksand, who are a band I've mentioned in one of my previous videos, who I really enjoyed. And this came out a year after that album. There's not an awful lot of consensus online and in reviews of what this band sounds like musically. And they are pretty difficult to pin down. Are they prog? Are they funk? Steely Dan get mentioned in quite a few reviews. And the sort of pop prog band Lake. They're also another great band. But what it is commercial, funky, melodic prog with some serious musical chops. There's a couple of tracks on here, the top 6 minutes, which reinforces that kind of idea that they're prog, I suppose. But listen to it without trying to label it, and it's just a really good album. The dragon on there suggests they're going for a slightly kind of proggy direction. You wouldn't normally get dragons on funk albums, that's for sure. But yeah, it's a bit confusing just what direction they're going in. But it's a really accomplished album and well worth listening to. And then, again, going to a new wave for British heavy metal. We have a band called Alcatrazz, surprisingly, as they share the name. But this time, it's Alcatrazz with 2 Zs. This was their debut album and their second album, Radio 5. And they just released these 2 albums. The first one in 1981, second in 82. And what are they? They're sort of vaguely bluesy melodic hard rock / AOR. Sounds like they want to be American. They remind me a lot of, again, British AOR band FM, who came later than this, but there's definitely that sound to them. And Bad Company at their most commercial. I suppose on this album, the final track, Run Wild, is the most new wave of British heavy metal sounding. In this album, it's just more of the same. You know, it's commercial melodic hard rock bordering on AOR. The final track on this, Miles Away, is bordering on power pop with plenty of saxophone in it. So, good band, well played, and again, one of those bands you just struggle to pin them down musically. Then the third band, going under the name Alcatrazz, is these guys. Alcatrazz with a C and 2 Zs. Gets confusing, doesn't it? Got these 2 albums to show you. This was the first one, No Parole from Rock and Roll. And this features Graham Bonnet on vocals, fresh from having played with Rainbow on just the one album, Down to Earth, which is a really good album. And he's got a fantastic voice, Graham Bonnet. You cannot go wrong with anything he sings on, really. And he has on guitar here Yngwie Malmsteen, the Swedish guitar legend. Would you call him a legend? I suppose so, certainly in his own mind. Who certainly this time was getting accused of just being a Ritchie Blackmore clone. And he does tend to go for that sort of neo-classical sort of style to his guitar playing. Whereas on this album, which doesn't show very well, does it, with all that glare on it, Graham Bonnet had got Steve Vai on board, and it's a very different sounding album. I mean, it's hard rock. They're both great, but this sounds like a classic 70s hard rock album with a guitarist nostalgic for the 18th century. And on this, Steve Vai sounds like the future of guitar playing. He really does. He conjures sounds out of his guitar rather than knitting classical motifs from a million notes. It's kind of sonic invention versus studious recreation, I suppose. There's great tracks on both albums. Hiroshima Mon Amour was possibly the standout on here. And on here, God Bless the Video opens the album. And it's very commercial, very in your face. And they're both really, really good albums. I mean, if I was having to choose between these two albums, I'd struggle. So I'm having to choose between this band and two others with the same name. So it's difficult. I mean, what goes without saying is that Graham Bonnet always seemed to surround himself with brilliant guitar players. He had a couple of guys in here as well who'd been in the sort of AOR band, melodic power pop type band, New England. Jimmy Waldo, I think, on keyboards, yeah, who's a big talent. So he was good at assembling a great cast around him, Graham Bonnet. I mean, the man has played with Richie Blackmore in Rainbow, he's played with Yngwie Malmsteen, Steve Vai, he's played with Michael Schenker in MSG, he's been with Bob Kulick, Mickey Moody. So, no stranger with playing with legends, that's for sure. So, who's it going to be? And can I carry this many albums at one time? Welsh Alcatrazz, English Alcatrazz, or the transatlantic Alcatrazz? Well, they all have something to offer, particularly the Welsh Alcatrazz, but it's got to be this bunch. They're probably most commercially successful of the three, and I grew up listening to these albums and still love them. So there you go. Graham Bonnet's Alcatrazz. And that's it for this time. I'll be back with another video soon. Probably not one of these, although, to be honest, looking through my collection, I could probably do half a dozen of these. There are so many bands who share names, but that'll be it for now. And take care, and I will see you soon.